Book 1, The Family, Section 12, of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 1, The Family, Section 12. St. Peter was breakfasting at 6:30, alone, reading last night's letters, while he waited for the coffee to percolate. It had been long since he had had an 8 o'clock class, but this year the schedule committee had slyly put him down for one. "He can afford to take a taxi over now," the dean remarked. After breakfast he went upstairs and into his wife's room. "I have a rendezvous with a lady," he said, tossing an envelope upon her counterpane. She read a note from Mrs. Crane, the least attractive of the faculty ladies, requesting an interview with the professor at his earliest convenience. As she wished to see him quite alone, might she come to his study in the old house, where she understood he still worked? "Poor Gottfried," murmured his wife. "One ought not to joke about it." St. Peter went into his own room to get a handkerchief and came back, taking up his suspended sentence. "I'm afraid it means poor Crane is coming up for another operation, or, worse still, that the surgeons tell her another would be useless. It's like the pit and the pendulum. I feel as if the poor fellow were strapped down on a revolving disc that comes around under the knife just so often." Mrs. St. Peter looked judicially at the letter, then at her husband's back. She didn't believe that surgery would be the subject of discussion when they met. Mrs. Crane had been behaving very strangely of late. Dr. Crane had married a girl whom no other man ever thought of courting, a girl of whom people always said, "Oh, she's so good," chiefly because she was so homely. They had 3 very plain daughters, and only Crane's salary to live upon. Doctors and surgeons kept them poor enough. St. Peter kissed his wife and went forth quite unconscious of what was going on in her mind. During the morning he telephoned Mrs. Crane and arranged a meeting with her at 5 o'clock. As the bell in the old house didn't work now, he waited downstairs on the front porch to receive his visitor and conduct her up to his study. It was raining drearily, and Mrs. Crane arrived in a rubber coat and a knitted sport hat belonging to one of her daughters. St. Peter took her wet umbrella and led her up the 2 flights of stairs. "I'm not very well appointed to receive ladies, Mrs. Crane. This was the sewing room, you know." There's Augusta's chair, which she insisted was comfortable. "Thank you." Mrs. Crane sat down, took off her gloves, and tucked wisps of damp hair up under her crocheted hat. Her bleak, plain face wore an expression of grievance. "I've come without my husband's knowledge, Dr. St. Peter, to ask you what you think can be done about our rights in the Outland patent. You know how my husband's health has crippled us financially, and we never know when his trouble may come on worse again. Myself, I've never doubted that you would see it as only right to share with us." St. Peter looked at her in amazement. "But, my dear Mrs. Crane, how can I share with you what I haven't got? Tom willed his estate and royalties in a perfectly regular way. The fact that he named my daughter as a sole beneficiary doesn't affect me any more than if he had named some relative of his own. I tell you frankly, I've never received $1 from the Outland patent." "It's all the same if it goes to your family, Dr. St. Peter. My husband must be considered in this matter. He spent days and nights working with Outland. Tom never could have worked his theory out without Robert's help. He said so more than once, in my presence and in the presence of others." "Oh, I believe that, Mrs. Crane. But the difficulty is that Tom didn't make any recognition of that assistance in his will." Mrs. Crane had set her head and advanced her long chin with meek determination. "Well, this is how it was, Professor. Mr. Marcellus came here a stranger to put in the Edison power plant just at the time the city was stirred up about Outland's being killed at the front. Everybody was wanting to do something in recognition of the young man. You brought Mr. Marcellus to our house and introduced him. After that he came alone, again and again, and he got round my husband. Robert thought he was disinterested and was only taking a scientific interest, and he told them a great deal about what he and Outland had been working on. Then Rosamond's lawyers came for the papers. Tom Outland had no laboratory of his own. He was allowed the use of a room in the physics building at my husband's request. He wanted to be there because he constantly needed Robert's help. The first thing we knew, your daughter's engagement to Marcellus was announced, and then we heard that all Outland's papers had been given over to him. Here St. Peter anticipated her. But, Mrs. Crane, your husband couldn't and wouldn't have kept Tom's papers. They had to be given over to his executor, who was my daughter's attorney. Well, I could have kept them if he couldn't. Mrs. Crane threw up her head as if to show that the worm had turned at last. Kept them until justice was done us, and some recognition had been made of my husband's part in all that research work. If he had taken the papers to court then, with all the evidence we have, we could easily have got an equity. But Mr. Marcellus is very smooth. He flattered Robert and got everything there was. But he didn't get anything from your husband. Outland's papers and apparatus were delivered to his executor, as was inevitable. That was a poor subterfuge, said Mrs. Crane with deep meaning. You know how unworldly Robert is, and as an old friend you might have warned us. Of what, Mrs. Crane? Why, that Marcellus saw there was a fortune in the gas my husband and his pupil had made, and we could have asked for our equity before we gave your son-in-law a free hand with everything. St. Peter felt very unhappy. He began walking up and down the little room. Heaven knows I'd like to see Crane get something out of it, but how? How? I've thought a great deal about this matter, and I've blamed Tom for making that kind of will. I don't think it occurred to the boy that the will would ever be probated. He expected to come back from the war and develop the thing himself. I doubt whether Robert, with all his superior knowledge, would have known the twists and turns by which the patent could be commercialized. It took a great deal of work and a special kind of ability to do that. A salesman's ability? Mrs. Crane was becoming nasty. If you like, but certainly Robert would have been no man to convince manufacturers and machinists any more than I would. A great deal of money was put into it, too, before any came back. Every cent Marcellus had, and all he could borrow. He took heavy chances. Crane and I together could never have raised 100th part of the capital that was necessary to get the thing started. Without capital to make it go, Tom's idea was merely a formula written out on paper. It had lain for 2 years in your husband's laboratory, and would have lain there for years more before he or I would have done anything about it. Mrs. Crane's dreary face took on more animation than he had supposed it capable of. It had lain there because it belonged there and was made there. My husband was done out of it by an adventurer, and his friendship for you tied his hands. I must say you've shown very little consideration for him. You might have warned us never to let those papers go. You see Robert getting weaker all the time and having those terrible operations, and our girls going shabby and teaching in the ward schools, and Rosamond riding about in a limousine and building country houses, and you do nothing about it. You take your honors, you've deserved them, we never forget that, and move into your new house, and you don't remember what it is to be in straitened circumstances. St. Peter drew his chair nearer to Mrs. Crane and addressed her patiently. Mrs. Crane, if you had any legal rights in the patent, I'd defend them against Rosamond as soon as against anyone else. I think she ought to recognize Dr. Crane's long friendship and helpfulness to Tom in some way. I don't see just how it can be done, but I feel it should be. And if you wish, I'll tell Rosamond how I feel. Why don't you put this matter before her? I don't care to ask anything of Mrs. Marcellus. I wrote her some time ago, and she replied to me through her lawyer, saying that all claims against the Outland patent would be considered in due order. It's not worthy of a man in Robert's position to accept hush money from the Marcelluses. We want justice, and my brother is confident the court will give it to us." "Well, I suppose Bright knows more about what the courts will do than I. But if you've decided to go to law about it, why did you come to me?" "There are some things the law don't cover," said Mrs. Crane mysteriously, as she rose and put on her gloves. "I wanted you to know how we feel about it." St. Peter followed her downstairs and put up her umbrella for her, and then went back to his study to think it over. His friendship with Crane had been a strange one. Out in the world they would almost certainly have kept clear of each other, but in the university they had fought together in a common cause. Both, with all their might, had resisted the new commercialism, the aim to show results that was undermining and vulgarizing education. The state legislature and the Board of Regents seemed determined to make a trade school of the university. Candidates for the degree of Bachelor of Arts were allowed credits for commercial studies, courses in bookkeeping, experimental farming, domestic science, dressmaking, and what-not. Every year the regents tried to diminish the number of credits required in science and the humanities. The liberal appropriations, the promotions, and increases in salary all went to the professors who worked with the regents to abolish the purely cultural studies. Out of a faculty of 60, there were perhaps 20 men who made any serious stand for scholarship, and Robert Crane was one of the staunchest. He had lost the deanship of the College of Science because of his uncompromising opposition to the degrading influence of politicians in university affairs. The honor went instead to a much younger man, head of the Department of Chemistry, who was willing to give the taxpayers what they wanted. The struggle to preserve the dignity of the university and their own had brought St. Peter and Dr. Crane much together. They were, moreover, the only 2 men on the faculty who were doing research work of an uncommercial nature, and they occasionally dropped in on one another to exchange ideas. But that was as far as it went. St. Peter couldn't ask Crane to dinner. The presence of a bottle of claret on the table would have made him uncomfortable. Dr. Crane had all the prejudices of the Baptist community in which he grew up. He carried them with him when he went to study at a German university and brought them back. But Crane knew that none of his colleagues followed his work so closely and rejoiced at his little triumphs so heartily as St. Peter. St. Peter couldn't help admiring the man's courage. Poor, ill, overworked, held by his conscience to a generous discharge of his duties as a teacher, he was all the while carrying on these tedious and delicate experiments that had to do with determining the extent of space. Fortunately, Crane seemed to have no social needs or impulses. He never went anywhere, except once or twice a year, to a dinner at the president's house. Music disturbed him too much. Dancing shocked him. He couldn't see why it was permitted among the students. Once, after Mrs. St. Peter had sat next to him at the president's dinner table, she said to her husband, "The man is too dreary. All evening his heavy underwear kept coming down below his cuffs, and he kept poking it back with his forefinger. I believe he thinks it's wicked to live with even so plain a woman as Mrs. Crane." After Tom Outland graduated from the university, he and Dr. Crane worked side by side in the physics building for several years. The older man had been of great assistance to the younger, without doubt, though that kind of help, the result of criticism and suggestion, is not easily reckoned in percentages. Still, St. Peter thought Crane ought to get something out of the patent. He resolved to see Louis about it. But first he had better talk with Crane himself and try to dissuade him from going to law. His brother-in-law, Homer Bright, would be tempted by the publicity which an action involving the Outland patent would certainly bring him. But he would lose the case and Crane would get nothing, whereas Louis, if he were properly approached, would be generous. St. Peter looked at his watch. He would go home now, and after dinner he would walk over to the physics building, where his colleague worked every night. He never went to see Crane at his house if he could help it. He lived in the most depressing and unnecessary ugliness. End of Book 1, The Family, Section 12.